estimated to, I'm sorry, the global economy is estimated to have contracted 4.3% in 2020. This is one of the worst scenarios since the Great Depression. This is mainly because of the social distancing measures, which are highly recommended to contain the virus spread, but are responsible for slowing down the economic activity, reducing consumption, and generate unemployment. To have an idea, the pandemic was responsible for the highest global unemployment since the World War II. Because of this, millions of people were dragged into poverty for the first time in the last 2 decades. The World Bank has estimated that between 88 million and 105 million people have fallen back into poverty in 2020. The inequalities within the countries have also increased, considering that poor people have suffered more with the economic downturns. This is because they normally worked in the informal sector and perform activities more sensible to the distancing measures. So in this scenario, one component of the social protection system have stood out as an efficient response to the economic and sanitary crisis, the cash transfer program, or CTPs. This is a non-contributory schemes which provide cash benefits to individuals and guarantees income security. Concerning the sanitary crisis, several studies have demonstrated the correlation between income level and effectiveness of distancing measures. This is because poor people still have to commute to work to generate income to survive. With the CTPs, they would be able to comply with the containment measures, and this would reduce the number of COVID cases. Regarding the economic crisis, even before the pandemic, the cash transfer programs have been effective too, to reduce economic losses, poverty, and inequalities. Because of this previous success, at the beginning of the pandemic, 88 countries around the world, such as Spain, the United States, and also Brazil, have announced 130 cash transfer programs. This is almost the double of the pre-COVID levels. So in Brazil, the government has provided a basic income called emergency aid to people with no formal job and low-income families. The benefit was first settled in 600 reais, which is something around $100 US, and then it suffered reductions over the months. The program has reached out over 60% of the Brazilian population and brought several gains. So, for example, it is estimated that the emergency aid was responsible for reducing the GDP downfall for something between 8.4 and 14.8% to only 4.1%. Moreover, during the time people were receiving the highest transfer, 600 reais, the extreme poverty rate was estimated at 2.3%. This is the lowest rate since 1976, when this kind of measurements start to be done. Later, the benefit decreased when the benefit decreased, the rate of extreme poverty increased, but it was still lower than the period before the pandemic in 2019. Concerning the impact of emergency aid on the inequalities, it is calculated that after the reduction of the benefit, the Gini rate in Brazil has increased from 0.474 in September to 0.494 in November. Without any benefit, the Gini would have reached 0.542 in 2020. So these increased inequalities are observed not only at national level, but also at international level, with developing countries suffering more with the pandemic crisis. First, because they already have less resilient economies. A great part of people living in developing countries were already poor or at risk of poverty. So developing countries also hold weaker social protection systems that mostly benefit formal workers, even though 70% of the workers in these countries are in informal sector. A second reason is the lack of resources. While low mid-income countries like Brazil can afford social protection measures, such as CTPs, other developing countries would need international support. To understand this disparity, in 2020, rich countries spent on average 24% of their GDPs in fiscal measures, while emerging markets spend 6% and low-income countries less than 2%. So leaving these countries behind would compromise directly and indirectly the achievement of social development goals, which are an international commitment, and would threaten the global economy recovery. For this reason, the international community must act and enable the implementation of social protection systems like cash transfer programs. This means not only mobilizing resources, which is a very important part, but also helping design policy strategies and provide information in the subject. So bearing in mind all these benefits and considerations about cash transfer program, we have gone one step further and evaluated the permanence and expansion of such programs in a universal basic income. So now Daniel will bring some insights into this topic.
Thank you, Anna. So about the universal basic income, we have some lessons from COVID-19 pandemic. The universal basic income is an unconditional cash transfer program that necessarily gathers three characteristics: no conditionality, cash as a transfer modality, and no targeting. During the pandemic, some proposals for cash transfers have advanced as a near UBI measures with outstanding results as shown previously. Nevertheless, none of them have implemented it in a broader sense. They have been also designed to last just during the pandemic, like in the Brazilian case. For this reason, the implementation of UBI would be interesting, not only to survive the current crisis and rebuild the economy, but also to be prepared for the future shocks. Out of the urgent demands and atypical conditions of the pandemic or any other crisis, several studies have demonstrated that basic income programs are efficient in alleviating poverty, improving health and school attendance, reducing criminality, boosting consumption, generating human capital, and stimulating the economy. So it can be also a remedy for the future rise of structural unemployment due to artificial intelligence. And however, two main oppositions have been constantly presented against UBI. First, it would discourage work, and second, the high costs of this kind of policy. Opposing the first criticism, several studies have been showing that labor supply has not dropped as an outcome of such policies. We can see some of these studies on the screen. In fact, according to Ian Shapiro, the UBI could improve the work market since it could diminish the transaction costs for hiring and dismissing workers, considering that no additional burdens would fall on the companies. Regarding the arguments that the UBI would be too expensive, there are several ways to find fiscal space and increase the budget for UBI. First, governments should rethink the allocation of resources, review public expenditure, and mitigate corruption. For instance, studies have demonstrated that in developing countries, military expenditures account for 40% of the average cost of social protection for packages. Besides, it would be cheaper for countries to invest in UBI, considering that it would reduce spending in other areas and save costs with bureaucracy. It is calculated at a UBI of €1,000 every month for all German citizens would be the equivalent to the social security system expenditure, which accounted for €900 billion in 2017. Moreover, countries can hold fiscally neutral transfer programs, which are financed by progressive income taxes and do not increase the public deficit. This type of distribution policy even brings microeconomic gains. For example, in Brazil, it is estimated that increasing the taxation of the 1% richest in R$1 in Brazil and transferring this amount to the 10% poorest would raise the aggregate consumption by 63 centavos of real. So it is also argued by critics that CTPs can cause inflation because of the increase of consumption. However, it had been demonstrated that UBI can introduce more competition among suppliers to meet the cash-driven demand, generating little inflation. Finally, on this topic, besides the key role of the international organizations in providing reliable information, conducting studies and supporting experiments concerning CTPs and UBI initiatives, they can also help in mitigating the entrenched ideological prejudice that surround these programs, which is a matter that I will briefly discuss now. So about this criticism against the UBI, this is a philosophical concern. Considering the existing literature on the topic, it can be affirmed that the main criticism against the UBI are not really based on pragmatic or economic reasons. According to the economist Branko Milanovic, all the intentions to reform capitalism have not succeeded in dealing with its individualistic ethic. This individualistic ethic consists in a possessive individualism in which the individual is essentially the owner of his or her person and capacities and does not owe anything to society. In fact, it is this unchallenged ethic that it is hidden in the argument that people would be discouraged to work. If the notion of integral individual property mailing his or her workforce is challenged, then one of the main pillars of the capitalist society is also shaken. The sacred and inverted commas possibility of selling and buying the workforce. However, this idea began to be contested in the 70s by the philosopher John Rawls. Discussing the idea of merit, Rawls sustained that a great part of what we are and what we have are in reality derived from collective work built by society as a whole. The idea of the UBI is based exactly on this idea that the wealth of every society is the cumulative social effort of generations, and consequently, all individuals would have the right to benefit from it. For that reason, it is important that the international community also addresses these ideological positions when designing the practical measures to put forward CTPs and UBI initiatives. Well, in conclusion, we can say that although CTP is a policy to be taken at a national level, it concerns the international community. Therefore, the world should take lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic to evaluate the permanence and expansion of CTPs in an universal basic income, which might be an efficient measure to promote income distribution, reverse setbacks in achieving the SDGs, and prevent the world from potential economy shocks. I would like to thank you very much for attending our panel, and we look forward to hear from you questions and comments. And thank you again, Christopher.
Excellent. Thank you both. That was a strong start to the panel. Just a quick reminder to everyone, I should have mentioned it at the start, but the session is being recorded. So obviously if you are worried about that, then please keep your camera off, and we can deal with questions in the chat. What I'll now do is invite Alex to present his paper, and yeah, really looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thanks, Christopher. Let me just share my screen. Second. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, super.
Yeah.
All right. Hello to everyone. It's a pity we can't have this conference in person, but I'm glad that it's taking place. Was initially very, very sad that that we couldn't have it last year, but I'm glad that it's taking place all the same. So my presentation today is on a slightly different topic than I had initially planned on presenting on, because such a long period of time has passed with the conference being delayed by a year. But it's on a similar sort of topic, and it basically goes to this layers of inequality idea that the panel has been titled on. And so my presentation is entitled, as you can see, International Cooperation Through Just Distributions, or Just Distributions Through International Cooperation. And then I'm sort of using this notion of subsidiarity as a principle in order to sort of frame some of the discussions around that. So basically the structure, the paper is still a draft paper. It still needs a fair deal of work, particularly in respect to the last part. But the first three parts are fairly complete, and there's not much more thinking to be done. But the version I'll present here is quite reductionist. It's quite a simplistic version of what I've written down. So if I gloss over some of the more nuanced points on some of these issues, do forgive me. Okay, so the first part is going to be on the short version of the long history of economic inequality reduction or non-reduction. Second part goes to different variants of economic inequality and how they've unfolded since the 1980s. And then the third part is the distributional implications of cross-border trends and the cross-border implications of distributional trends, and I'll unpack what I mean by that in a moment. And then finally, the question I'm still toying with and struggling terribly to answer, so I'd be happy for more than questions, but also answers if you have any, is who should be legally responsible for which distributional outcomes. And I think it also speaks to Anna, Luiza, and Daniel's presentation, which is sort of this idea of, is it supposed to be the state, countries, or is there some sort of role for international cooperation? And then I think Simon's paper will probably speak to a level down from the state level, look at subnational sort of actors and who is responsible for which types of distributions is a question I've been thinking about a lot and one I struggle to answer. In any event, the short version of the long history of economic inequality reduction or non-reduction, I take sort of from this work of Walter Scheidel, who is a historian. He wrote this book called The Great Lever in 2017, which basically looks at the history of economic inequality since the Stone Age. It's a really fascinating read if you haven't read it already. So the default position over the course of the last 12,000 odd years, he tells us, is that inequality tends to grow in the medium to long run, economic inequality of income and wealth. And that tends to be the default position. But then that you have these four horsemen of the apocalypse type characters that tend to reduce them from time to time. And so the four that he explores in the book are mass mobilization warfare, sort of the type of warfare that you see in relation to, the examples he gives are World Wars I and II. You have transformative revolution transformative has a very particular meaning for Scheidel, and if you're interested in that, we can get into it. But an example would be the Russian Revolution, sort of in the early 1900s. Plague, a very, very severe plague, has been shown to reduce economic inequality. And the one he goes with there, sort of like the Black Death type of plague, where so many people died that it severely affected the supply of labor, and so raised the level of income received by laborers effectively vis-a-vis capital and so forth. And so you had this inequality reduction. Flag COVID-19 there. I think he again has, he doesn't say that these events will always lead to inequality reduction. He just says that, you know, the sort of long-term inequality reductions that you've seen have resulted from these types of events, but sometimes they don't lead to inequality reduction. Sometimes they in fact exacerbate the issue, as with COVID-19. And then the final one is state collapse, which is less relevant today, but sort of the collapse of Rome and those sorts of issues that he looked at. So I've put this quote here. I'm not going to read it, but in essence, it just sort of summarizes Scheidel's position. And what was very bleak about the book for me, and what sort of driven a lot of my work since, is this idea that he says, all of us who prize greater economic equality would do well to remember that, with the rarest of exceptions, it was only ever brought forth in sorrow. Be careful what you wish for. And as someone who's always advocating for the reduction of economic inequality, it was quite a devastating conclusion for at least 2 weeks after the book. I was very depressed. In any event, so now I'll zoom in sort of on my focus, which is sort of this period since the 1980s. And I'll talk about inequality of income and wealth, and how it's different variants of it, and sort of how it's evolved since the 1980s. And so I look at, I'll just pop them all out here, different types. So I'll start with global inequality, which is if you consider the planet as a whole, as if there were no countries, just one country, and all 8 billion of us are living in one country. And I think since the 1980s, slowly we've moved to a position where actually, in terms of both income and wealth, you've actually seen a reduction in global inequality, which is quite interesting. And we could talk more about that and the details of that later if you're interested. International inequality is one of the components of global inequality, and the other one would be intranational, so within a state. And sort of broadly speaking, those two together would make up your global inequality. So at the international inequality level, things are a bit more complicated. You've seen a general sort of reduction in international inequality of economic and wealth between nations, but this was a lot of this comes from the work of Milanovic, who I think Daniel also had mentioned. But in any event, I think that story is a bit more complicated, because if you wait for population size, then international inequality has reduced, because countries like India and China have grown very rapidly in comparison to the rest of the world. And so you see this reduction in inequality between China and India and other countries, mostly in Asia, and sort of the richer European North American countries, and Japan as well. And then if you don't wait for population size, then it gets a bit more complicated, because since the 1980s, a lot of countries such as my own South Africa, and I think to a degree Latin American countries, other countries on the African continent, haven't quite caught up to the rest of the world, and have in fact in some cases fallen further behind. So it would be, I think, fair to say that in some ways international inequality has declined quite significantly, but there's a strong regional element to that, with Asia catching up to Europe and North America, and sort of Africa and Latin America to some degree being left behind a bit more. And then within nations, of course, we all know the story quite well. I think inequality is pretty much skyrocketed everywhere, more or less. So within countries, you've throughout the world more or less seen a rapid increase of economic inequality, both in terms of income and wealth. And then I thought I would flag the subnational levels. I was doing some work with a colleague the other day and looking at unemployment in South Africa. I'm from South Africa, so I work a lot on South Africa, and I was looking at unemployment in South Africa at the municipal level, which is sort of one level down from the provincial level, which is one level down from the national level. And so if you look at it from that perspective, there are also interesting disparities that pop up there. We were looking at gender and unemployment, and in some municipalities, there is no gender unemployment gap. In some, male unemployment is basically half of female unemployment, which is also really interesting. So there's a really wide gap there, for example. And I imagine to the extent that I can find data, it would probably show me a similar story in terms of income distribution, that within countries, there are also multiple layers and in different places with different types of inequalities being exhibited. Okay, so then very quickly, let me run through this this next section, which is got to do with the distributional implications of cross-border trends and the cross-border implications of distributional trends. So what I mean by that, essentially, in the first instance, is that there are distributional implications of cross-border trends. And so in the paper, I look at technological change and globalization and how that's played into all of these inequality trends that I've just unpacked in the second section. And I make a clear, I sort of take a clear position that I think technological change and globalization are not one and the same thing, but they certainly come together. Technological change enables globalization, and perhaps to an extent even is a form of globalization in and of itself. But in any event, these sorts of trends in relation to trade, capital flows across borders, the rise of international finance, data, information, know-how, all these sorts of things, unpack these sort of trends and show how they've both led to rising inequality within countries and also to a degree contributed to the reduction of inequality between them, and also, to reducing inequality at sort of the global level. But then I also look at the other side of the relationship, which is what the cross-border implications of distributional trends are. And I find those quite interesting. So I think as you see China rise, for example, there are tensions, geopolitical tensions that arise from the reduction of inequality between countries. And at the same time, you see this increase of inequality within countries, which I think fundamentally shapes cooperative propensities among countries. And so I think I've also put another example there of underconsumption and external trade, and maybe in the questions we could talk about that. But it's also the idea that if you have lots of inequality domestically, you tend to search for economic opportunities abroad. And if you're a very large country like China, domestic inequality tends to lead to you exporting a lot of your products. Sort of goes back to this Hobbesian notion, I guess, of the early 1900s, where underconsumption sort of tested as a cause of the First World War, and looks at how it sort of drove colonialization and these sort of things. But the more fundamental problem that I have is that these cross-border implications shape cooperative propensities through this distributional mechanism. So to the extent that globalization, technological change drive economic inequality, they also drive the inability of countries to cooperate with one another. And I think in contemporary times, that's important for economic distributions themselves. And here I'm thinking of issues such as taxation, where capital easily crosses borders. And so without cooperation between countries, taxation becomes very difficult. I think that leads to taxation being less progressive, corporate taxation and individual taxation as well, I think. So it's that sort of thing. So if your cooperative propensities are lower, then you end up with sort of constrained ability to reduce inequalities. For other reasons, lower cooperative propensities are also problematic. For example, I would say in the space of climate change, if you want more cooperation in order to address climate change, then a general lowering of cooperative propensities is a problem as well. So you sort of have this loop, and then I think for that reason I should change my title, because it sort of goes both ways. There's a reinforcement from one way to the other. Globalization drives inequalities, and then inequalities to a degree break down sort of international cooperation, and then you need international cooperation to reduce the inequalities, and that's the sort of linkage I'm thinking about. And then finally, I will just take maybe 1 or 2 minutes to just talk about the subsidiarity idea, because I really still am posing it as a question more than anything else. So just to sort of frame this from a subsidiarity perspective, so subsidiarity, in the paper I unpack different notions of it. It's obviously a bit of a contested concept, but in general, I just take it to be the authority to do something should be given to the actor who can do it most effectively. It should be, is more or less, it's just a rough definition of that. And then using that, I sort of go and I ask a bunch of questions here, and the foremost question is, who's best placed to effectively deliver a desired distributional outcome? And I think, given the discussion that precedes this question here, I think from my perspective, it should be states, probably countries that try and drive down inequality, but then, their ability to do that hinges very much on their ability to cooperate. So that's, sort of, you have to internationalize potentially to some degree some of the responsibility for distributional outcomes. And it would be nice to do that in something a bit more concrete than SDG 10, for example, which is a commitment rhetorically, politically, to reducing inequality between and within countries, but it's not, a concrete legal instrument that says this is the person who is responsible for distributions. And then I think about that in respect of subject matter as well, is to say, what's the most effective tool to reduce inequality? So for me, taxation is the natural one, but there are other mechanisms both related to taxation and not. So, taxation is obviously relevant for something like a UBI. But you can also think of competition policy, for example, or there are other areas that are very quickly emerging, and what work you do in one space should be taken into account in the other. So there's probably some limits to taxation as well in some places, and so you would want to think about other policy mechanisms. But so I'm just thinking through sort of those two things mainly: which actors, and then which subject matters, and who's most effectively placed, and then finally, how does one translate that into law? So that's more or less the question that I'm asking. Still working on an answer. Thank you all for listening.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think that final mention of the Sustainable Development Goals is an excellent segue onto to Simon's paper, which I know touches upon that as well. So I'll just let Simon jump right in.
Can you see the presentation? Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Great. So good morning. Pleased to be speaking with you today from Toronto, even though it's just past the middle of the night. We're still in COVID lockdown until June 2nd, without access to parks and recreation facilities and other diversions like patios and beer gardens. So the prospect of getting up to milk the cows and log into a Zoom call to discuss both deeply and broadly aspects of international law is, well, going to be the best thing I do this weekend. So again, very pleased to be joining you, and very interesting papers from my panel members. My remarks will be brief. I hope to give you a sense of the scope of my work, which is a consideration of a selected history of 3 subnational jurisdictions and the quality of their engagement with statutory and regulatory efforts to further equality, or put another way, defend against the scourges of want and fear. A short digression, I'll point you to the picture on the title page. If you look at it, it's a somewhat fuzzy image, but it's courtesy of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum in Hyde Park, New York. And it's a 5th draft of his speech that he delivered on January 6, 1941, which is now a little over 80 years ago. It is what became known as the 4 Freedoms speech. And Roosevelt delivered his remarks at his 8th State of Union address, and his overall assertion was that freedom meant the supremacy of human rights everywhere. And that is, if you will, the ambitious starting point for my work. I'm in a program at the the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and the program is called Human Security and Global Law. Its ethos is that public law has moved beyond the traditional confines of the state, and it's evolved into a sort of hegemonic global public law, both from an economic perspective and one from a perspective of social protection. And this global public law cannot be interpreted merely as a neoliberal economic regulation of free trade, if you will, due to the response of social movements and other reactions. There's also increasingly widespread recognition of social, employment, cultural, education, and other rights. This regulatory field, the object of my professors' and colleagues' work, is referred to as global law. And the leitmotif of our lines of research is the achievement of more human security through integral security and that global law. And certainly the new risk society includes this new conception of security, protection in all areas where a risk or a hazard to citizens is detected. And it bears some focus that the UN's concept of human security is giving a more complete meaning in advanced societies to the flood of new rights and values that are taking hold globally. Perhaps a quick word on domestic jurisdictions and their relevance to a discussion of distributions of international law. Many people find international law abstract or diffuse or not relevant to their needs, not fit for purpose, if you will. It bears noting, however, indeed, that the Oxford Reports on International Law in Domestic Courts project does not include lists of citations to domestic instruments and legislation mentioned in the decision, as they make plain, quote, such references generally have only a minor relevance to the international law issues involved, and only key domestic cases are listed, as focusing too much on domestic case law is a distraction for the international law researcher, unquote, which is contrary opposite, I believe, to my fellow panel members' efforts today, is that law presupposes society and society law, and society is, if you will, at the most minute micro level. Mind you, Oxford Reports does cover case law not only from states, but also from certain territorial entities that are not generally classified as states. And this is done in recognition of the fact that judicial decisions of such entities can be of interest to the international legal regime. So it does publicize judicial decisions from such territorial entities not classified as states, or given the Scottish context, might be more appropriate to say not yet classified as states. The many forms that international law takes, well, they're well known to most of us here: treaties, customary law, and so forth. one of the standards that has been set recently, and Alex referenced these, is the SDGs. For the purposes of my research, SDG 5 and SDG 8 are pertinent, as they both pertain to women and girls equality. And SDG 5 has to do specifically with, if you will, equal pay for work of equal value. Now, on about 3 years ago, at the UN's 73rd General Assembly, a group called EPIC, it's a coalition of the ILO, the OECD, and UN Women gathered to make a pledge on how to address equal pay for work of equal value. This convening was aligned with a business investment forum, several global leaders, several heads of states, several CEOs of major multinational companies, heads of business associations, workers and civil society organizations, and representatives of renowned universities. They all pledged publicly to demonstrate commitment to accelerating progress towards equal pay for work of equal value. In my jurisdiction, we call it pay equity. And this was all done in line with SDG target 8.5 of the SDGs. Now, what does this mean for, if you will, domestic jurisdictions? My paper focuses on 3 jurisdictions, excuse me, Alberta, Catalonia, and Scotland, all who have, if you will, practical aspirational sovereignty attached to them, which is a claim of primacy and greater ethical means and legal means for their people. Compliance with international law for these jurisdictions is now a central part of evaluating the lawfulness of government actions. And I expect the assessment and utility of national statutes, national regulations, and programmatic efforts of governments and their agencies and their transfer payment agencies on SDG matters will yield insights into the national pursuit of progress to address freedom from want and freedom from fear, and permit domestic jurisdictions to compare themselves against the national efforts. Moreover, the pursuit of policies and programmatic efforts to create statutes and regulations to further domestic aims and objectives have quite naturally, as one might expect, been central to all 3 subnational jurisdictions' differentiation strategies. And what of them? Taking gender equality SDG 8.5.1 as a stepping off point, what might we find? And this is where the research meets historical analysis. And I should just reference or recommend anything to do written by Martin Laughlin, who has delved deeply into the world of political jurisprudence. He maintains that law is not simply an instrument of ruling power, that political jurisprudence is at its core the people organized into territorially bound units within which authoritative governing arrangements have been established. The political of aspirational sovereignty is the foundation and the buttresses of how members of that entity sense justice and injustice. They sense right and wrong. They sense freedom and fear. They sense good and its polar opposite. Now, many of you are unlikely to have seen this logo. It's brand new in Canada. It's the Buffalo Declaration. It was outlined in 2020 by a series of elected officials from the Western province of Alberta here in Canada. It essentially said that there was such hostility to the national government and its efforts at redistributive federalism, what we call equalization here in Canada, that they demanded immediate action to right this perceived wrong, or they will seek independence. This follows a long tradition in Alberta of being separate and distinct, if you will, politically. In 2001, a former Prime Minister of Canada this was prior to him becoming prime minister, put pen to paper in the thing that is now known colloquially as the firewall letter, where he said that Alberta needed to resume control of the powers that it possessed under the Constitution, but that we have allowed the federal government to exercise. An intelligent use of these powers will help Alberta build a prosperous future in spite of a misguided and increasingly hostile government in Ottawa. Really sort of a divergent point of view. So in Canada, most people associate sovereignty movements or separatism movements with Quebec. But on the other side of the country, we have this burgeoning area. My future research it will be with Alberta specifically, will relate to environmental matters, specifically environmental protection, given that Alberta is home to known oil reserves that are comparable to Saudi Arabia. So how does such a jurisdiction rate against its national jurisdiction, Alberta versus Canada? This is just some basic analysis from the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap report, which was produced in March of this year. I've got a few items here listed as it relates to gender equality, so you can see where they're going. From my vantage point, the two that are of most interest would be economic participation and educational attainment. So as you can see in Canada, this is for women, educational attainment is outstanding as rated internationally through this metric. But somehow that educational attainment is not being matched with labor force participation, or, if you will, pay, economic opportunity. Number 1 in qualification, number 40 in economic opportunity. The second subnational jurisdiction focus of my work is Catalonia, a very well-known movement of late. I was there in 2019 in September and actually was witness to a good deal of public violence in the streets. How do they rate for the World Economic Forum as it relates to gender equality? Again, drawing your attention to economic participation and opportunity as a metric, not particularly well as a nation state. How do they rate for educational attainment? Middling, shall we say. Overall ranked 14th in the world, however. And I would expect, given Catalonia's economic might, that they would likely have considerably better ratings. The third jurisdiction, the subject of my work, is Scotland. Now there's an old joke, in fact my late mother used to tell it. She was from Airdrie, just to the east of Glasgow, that speaks to a certain disdain for things from Westminster, and it goes like this. How many Westminster Scottish office civil servants does it take to change a light bulb on the Clyde? And the answer is none. 12 of them will write a report entitled Scotland's Darkness Explained, a Guide for Business. And what I think that illustrates very clearly is what Benedict Anderson in Imagined Communities puts across. He describes it as mendacious cultural regional cliches. And the research is not about particular nationalist mythologies, but about how these nationalisms serve as stepping off points to assess claims to seek to make a better country with the help of normative standards like the SDGs as a frame from which to make a reasonable assessment of the efforts for more freedom, of the efforts for more freedom from want and fear. Now, the work is being approached with humility and skepticism, and it will locate evidence of what these foregrounded subnational jurisdictions have accomplished in relation to distribution of public goods aligned to international legal standards. And I apologize for the surface level overview, but the detail would have made for I would imagine, an eye-glazing presentation. I look forward to your thoughts on this approach and your questions for my fellow panelists. Thank you, Chris, for organizing.
Excellent. Thank you all for those wonderful papers. I can already see some really good points of connection and interplay between them. And also thank you all very much for staying so well to time as well, which leaves us some good chance to have some good discussion off the back of that. So before I abuse my position as the chair to sort of jump in with any questions, does anyone else have any questions they want to raise? Again, perfectly free to sort of type it into the chat box, or just to sort of raise your hand actually, or using the function here and to jump in and ask the question. In that case, I will start it off, because I certainly have quite a few. So I think one thing that I really enjoyed in listening to these is this question of scope. Obviously starting off with a really sort of concrete look at what, how we deal with inequality and what sort of mechanisms are effective and what the sort of impacts of that are. But I think what's quite interesting to see is there's always been this debate around at what scope do you put in place those sorts of measures, small pilot schemes, regional, local, national. And then hearing more about from Alex and Simon about at what scale should we even be looking at this question of inequality in the first place? Like, what is the right measure? What is the right space to be assessing that? And then what happens when that scope changes from beneath us, in the sense of, the nation state isn't going to stay in a unitary nation state in some cases, and how is that going to affect things when we don't get to choose necessarily our own lens that we look at things and just assume the nation state is straightforward. So really what I'd like to ask, and this is for everyone, is in this moment of change, when the importance of the nation state seems to be at the forefront in terms of operating public health type programs, but at the same time is being questioned in the sense of its inability to actually produce economic equality for us all. Where in that nexus do you see the future? Is it still with the state, or do we have to look beyond that in the sense of how we're going to achieve meaningful equality that goes right down to the local level? And feel free, any of you, to jump in with that one.
In what order do we take this?
It looks like you volunteered yourself to go first, Alex. Go ahead.
It seems that way. I think I'll start with the last bit, because I find it a really important and difficult question to answer, one that I think about quite frequently. So I think in a lot of my work, I'm approaching these questions from the international law perspective. And so, to a large degree, you do take the nation state as sort of a singular entity sometimes, and sort of as a homogeneous actor of sorts. And that's obviously quite problematic from many views. But I think from the view of international law as currently conceived, the answer would be quite simple in a way, because it's a law of the law as between sovereigns, I guess, right? And to the extent, for me, I've always viewed it as, from the international law perspective, as cooperation being potentially necessary in order to stay sovereign in the first place, because if you can't deliver distributive justice for your people, then are you really a state in the first place? Is an interesting question. But then if you look at it from the ground up, then you have to start looking at the political realities of particular countries and their forms of governance and so forth, right? could have a Swiss-style democracy, which is very direct and very localized. You could have a non-democracy, China situation. You can have a high inequality democracy. You can have a Scandinavian-style democracy. There are many options. And so how that all fits together, then when you look at it from an international law perspective, is really interesting, and I think sort of constrains a lot of what is possible, I guess, or maybe not constrains, but definitely affects, because ideally not everyone has the same view on what economic distribution should look like. So if you're looking at it from a democratic perspective, then maybe you want that to develop from the bottom up. But then, when does it cross over into international territory? And I think the answer there is to the extent that it deprives other countries of their goals. So yeah, I don't know if that answers any questions. Those are just sort of my initial thoughts on that. Yeah.
Alex, well said. I would suggest posing a question is the best way to answer one, and that is, when I look at at least two of the jurisdictions that I'm giving thought to, Alberta, certain actors within it definitely wish to be a nation state because they believe that would give them sufficient authority to lead and implement policies that they believe are best for their jurisdiction. It so happens that they believe that the Paris Accord is not good for their jurisdiction. They sit on a lot of oil encased in sand. Conversely, or if I can put it this way, the contrary opposite would be Scotland, in that they're interested in becoming a nation state, because one reason certainly is they're very concerned that Britain has left the European Union, and the social protections and the distributive justice that was part of the European Charter. So nation states, absolutely critical. If I can put it this way, it's a bit of a tautology. So say the political actors in those domestic jurisdictions who are seeking that status for completely different reasons, given an engagement with international law and international movements for freedom from fear and freedom from want.
Christopher, I don't know if I can say something.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The questions were not addressed for me directly, but maybe I can address some points. Making another question, I think, when Alex said about concrete measures to achieve on some equality in international level. He said about taxation, but he also mentioned some other measures, but I couldn't foresee these measures. I am quite concerned about it. It is one question that I ask myself: how can we do something in terms of equality in international level beyond taxation? And so it's a quite interesting question that I would like to ask him. Sorry, Alex, to put you in this position.
No, you should, because it's something I have thought about, and I don't have wonderful answers for it, I don't think, but I have some thoughts, I guess. So I think there are measures directly related to taxation, like UBIs, for example, right? So there are those measures, first of all. So once you've looked at taxation per se, so I think there's sort of two functions of taxation and reducing inequality. The first is just to reduce inequality, right? Just to be progressive in the sense that it reduces inequality per se. The other is to raise revenue and then to do good stuff with that revenue to reduce inequality. And one way would be to, I think, implement a UBI. I'm also quite in favor of a UBI in many places. Quite an extensive one, I think, would be good. But then, yes, then we get into your territory of what is affordable and what's not affordable. Next week, I'm presenting at a conference on competition law and inequality, which is also quite interesting. So that's one of the things that I had sort of just flagged. There's some scope there, I think, because there's also competition in general has quite a bit to do with what's driving inequality and sort of market concentration and these sorts of things, right? So in that conference, my co-author and I, what we've sort of done is we've split measures that you could actually effectively use into sort of the pre-distribution and redistribution sort of buckets, right? So like pre-distribution being, what do you do with the initial distribution prior to there being taxation and redistribution? And I think at the pre-distribution level, there are some things that you can do, and they sort of, some of them go to private law, some of them go to sort of like mixtures of public and private law mechanisms. So something like competition law could potentially be relevant. So the extent to which you allow mergers, for example, right, and allow economies to become very concentrated, that has economic implications. So there's conceivably an angle there. The way that you enforce abuse of dominance laws, that sort of stuff. The way you construct markets in competition law analysis, even. And to just bring a distributional lens into all of competition law thinking, I think is one interesting route. Another interesting route is to look at company law, corporate law, contract law, these sorts of private areas of law. I don't know if you've read, is it Katerina Pistor's book, Coding Capital? Is quite a nice book, and I think she's got some interesting suggestions there for what one could.
It's on my list.
It's on your list. Very good.
Sure.
Yeah, so she sort of looks at all the private law mechanism one uses to accumulate wealth in the first place, to code capital, as she calls it. And I think there's perhaps some scope there to make some changes that could be helpful to how we define the corporate form, and what that means for how easily the corporate form can move things across borders, protect assets, etc., etc. So those are sort of my two cents on non-taxation measures. I'm still heavily in favor of taxation spearheading the effort, though.
Excellent, thank you. Just want to check, Annalisa, do you have anything you want to add to that? Because I've also noticed that Anna also has a question, but I wanted to let you have a chance to answer that first one first.
No, she can make her question. It's okay.
Excellent. In that case, a question from Anna, and then after that, I've got a question from Yuri.
Thank you, and thanks to the panelists for these fantastic presentations. I very much enjoyed them, really stimulating. So I think I have sort of two questions, and the first one really is mostly, I guess, related to Anna and Daniel's paper, although I think it follows on a little bit from what you were just mentioning there, Alex, about Katerina Pistor's work. And what I was thinking about was whether you see any promise in either one of two developments. So I think we've seen this development with modern monetary theory, so this argument that's been made by a body of heterodox economists that actually there is no hard limit to the state's ability to print and distribute money. So I was wondering, if this is relevant to your arguments about the UBI and whether you see promise in that particular theory. And relatedly, there are some scholars recently working in a similar tradition to Pistor. So I'm thinking here of Christine Desan and others who've been looking at money and thinking about money as a legal institution and as a public institution, and making some of those arguments that if we actually look at money and how it works, it doesn't arise as a means, to facilitate trade or barter the way that many of the neoclassical economists would have argued that it does, but rather it is very much a public credit medium, and one that is mediated by the state. And when we see money that way, it again helps us to counteract those ideas and arguments that we've seen around austerity, of the need to balance budgets, of the need to treat the state's budget the way we would the budget of an individual. So I was just interested to know if you saw any promise in those theories for your work. And then the second question was to all of the panelists, and it's related, and it is, can we as lawyers or legal academics, international or otherwise, come up with solutions for inequality, or sort of by ourselves, like with using the law, or is this something that we'll always have to engage with economic theory and economic theorists? And I was curious to hear your experiences and perhaps challenges that you may have found as legal scholars trying to engage with inequality and trying to become fluent in economic theories that relate to these topics. Thanks.
Is there a prescribed order that you can give us, Anna?
However you would like to, Alex. I fear that you are volunteering yourself again there. So
I can go first. I don't mind. I just don't want to take up all the time because I fear I've already spoken too much. I think the one interesting thing about the monetary issue that you raised in the first question, I'll just add 2 cents there. I think, I've given it a little bit of thought. I think it raises for me the distinction between like level of development between different countries. So I think the answer to that particular question really does depend on which countries you're looking at. I think if you're looking at sort of richer countries, I see a lot of promise in essentially printing money and using that to fund welfare programs. I think there's some scope there. In South African context, for example, I don't know if it's as promising because there are some different challenges, and our national debt is a problem, I think, and inflation is something that is much more on our radar, even now, less since COVID, because everyone's been cutting interest rates. But yeah, I think country context may be relevant there. Beyond that, I won't say much more. Take up more time. I'm on the second question. I think yes, we do need to engage with economic theory. I think insufficient. I think there's been I think particularly this competition law thing, for example, that made me see that very much, right? Because the concepts are dominated by economic theory and a particular view of what markets are and efficiency is and that sort of thing. But those are legal constructs. So, I think there's real value in learning the language of economics and then deconstructing the devices it uses to the extent that that's useful for your own purposes. And so one of the questions then, when it comes to all these things is conceptually, what is a market and what is efficiency and what does that mean from a lawyer's perspective? But yeah, it is challenging. First of all, to just get the language to do the constructing and the understanding of economics, which is not necessarily our foremost discipline, but yeah, also in just having the authority sometimes to tell an economist off and be like, no, actually, I disagree with this particular economic concept that you've deployed here and how you're using it, right? And it's not a given thing, and maybe does warrant redefinition or something. So yeah, I think it's important. I think lawyers tend to do this thing of also, especially rights lawyers. I come from a human rights background initially, so and then I went in an economic law direction later, and I think those sort of diverge greatly, and I think they shouldn't. I think there's an overlap, and there's a need for lawyers that go in those different directions to talk to one another as well, because you can't really separate the two out so easily. But yeah, those are my 2 cents. I think that's it from me for the rest of the.
Well, can I simply address the second of your 2 questions, and that is, can lawyers make a difference on their own? I think the answer is no. I think there needs to be interdisciplinary interaction to make real success, to make real progress. To give you a sense, in my jurisdiction, 30 years ago, we established a formula for calculating pay equity, comparing male-dominated labor to female-dominated labor. And the phrase we would use, yes, you can compare oranges to apples. So you needed a statute followed by a mechanism, a formula that would permit an analysis of workplace compensation and the value placed on male jobs versus the value placed on female jobs. It's all part of the law, it's all part of the regulations, but there's an awful lot of economics that goes into that. And now it's part of the ethos of an Ontario workplace is pay equity and the law married to economic justice.
Well, Christopher, Anna made some interesting questions. The first one was addressed for me and Anna. And well, it's quite interesting, this modern monetary theory. Here in Brazil, we are discussing this theory. André Lara Rezende is one great economist that was in the government, and in the 90s, he's now writing a lot of papers, articles, and publishing those papers in newspapers, saying that we can print money simply. So it's a quite interesting, this debate that it's happening here in Brazil. I'm not in a position to say that I agree with him, because I'm not economist. But answering the second question that Anna made, I can say that I need to go to economics. I'm considering, after my doctorate, my PhD, I hope that I can have my title in 2 years ahead. I'm considering study economics, and we need to do this intersection between subjects. So I see here in Brazil a lot of economists going to law to study law, and there's a quite interesting this debate is going here, and I think we can manage to use in the future, I think, to calculate all these variables, all these data, using artificial intelligence to see what is the best, what is the practical policy to a program like a UBI initiative in Brazil or elsewhere. So I think we need to use all these tools, artificial intelligence, economics, law, and so forth. I don't know if Anna would like to add some points on this discussion, maybe.
Yeah, I agree with all the concerning the second question. I agree with all the panelists. I think law itself, it's not enough. So in my short academic experience, I couldn't find satisfactory answers to the problems I've been analyzing just using law. So I have to use tools of economics and other subjects as well, like political science. And I think in Brazil, we have been this problem that the law scholars have been isolated, just studying, analyzing the problems using law, and they are not corresponding to the reality. So in Brazil, currently, like more recently, lawyers start to use different areas of knowledge to address the problems, and we are now realizing that we need this interdisciplinarity. And I also agree with this. I think it's essential.
Excellent. That's all wonderful, and it's nice to see how everything has fitted together. And it seems like there's some sort of broad consensus, even from very different kind of starting points in terms of the scope. We're building a big picture. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. I am aware that it is 12:20, which is the official end point of the session, to give everyone time to have lunch and get ready before the roundtable. We do have one question that was mentioned in the chat from Yuri, just looking at the question of the shift from international law to global law and sort of any challenges that are there. If anyone wants any last pithy mentions on that, then feel free. But obviously I'm aware of the time, so if so, then yeah, let's keep it concise. If not, it may be something that maybe you can pick up in some emails and get some chat going with you afterwards. So yeah, just want to thank you all again. Those are really great papers. There was a really good discussion, and looking forward to seeing you at the later sessions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everyone.